Steve has participated in the startup of 7 oil and gas companies, and he has more than $2 billion of direct experience in mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. But more than this, he's an active and an engaged community leader, and he gives back in many valuable ways, including on the board of a local nonprofit organization called In From the Cold, and he also provides mentorship in the post-secondary sector. I realize there's a bunch of students in the audience today, and for those of you who are students, I'd like you to pay close and particular attention to Mr. Cloutier's lessons that he's sharing with you. And remember that innovation is not just about the what, but it's also about the how. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me, or please join me in welcoming Mr. Steve Cloutier.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, and thanks to the University of Lethbridge and the Agility team, David Hill, Reed Pisoni, and the rest of the folks that have put together a wonderful program. I can tell you initiatives like this were nowhere on the radar screen when I was doing my undergrad 35 years ago. It's a wonderful resource that you have here, and I would encourage you to use it to the fullest extent. I'm down here because I like to move around, and behind a podium is not my favorite spot, and I've been given a wireless mouse, so hopefully everyone can see me, and I'm pretty sure everyone can hear me with this mic. We were in Calgary last night, and I decided to shed the mic and use my natural voice to project, which I think worked well, but in this facility I think the microphone actually works a little bit better. Just to set up today's topic, Dr. Brown spoke a little bit about where I've come, and I've, to those for whom having icons that include the Canadians and the Maple Leafs, that might be heresy for some, but it's a little bit of a roadmap to where I've spent time. Leslie mentioned back east, back west, and now in the prairies. So I'll talk a little bit about how I got from there to here. I'll also spend some time injecting throughout the discussion the importance of mentors. And sometimes you don't even know that you've got a mentor. But it's important nonetheless to recognize those opportunities where you can learn from those that have expertise and form a relationship so that you can use those lessons to help you in your, whether it's your academic career, your lifestyle, or your professional career. We'll also talk throughout the morning about taking risks, and risk-taking is not for everyone, and certainly there are different types of risks that people are better able to absorb. In my case, I have very low tolerance for physical risk, so you're not likely going to see me doing helicat skiing, bungee jumping, or those sorts of high-impact sports. My risk-taking proclivities are more in the areas of starting things, putting some capital at risk. That's where I feel my comfort zone works. But for others, that might not be where you sit. And so it's really important to start to develop a sense of where your appetite is for risk, because unfortunately, sometimes you don't realize that the risk-taking moment is upon you until it is right in front of you. And sometimes with that fear right there, it's difficult to have sort of an objective view of how you're able to manage risk. Then I will finish off the discussion with some case studies. As Dr. Brown mentioned, I've been involved in several startups, and through each of those, I've gleaned a number of lessons, and I've tried to highlight those that I thought were most important. But in the end, everything is a lesson, everything is a building block. I can tell you that if my life was depicted by a shape, it would be like a triangle where there's a big wide base, and every year I layered onto that. And I can tell you, once you've got yourself to kind of the point of the triangle, there's a lot of fun things that can happen, but the only way you get to the top is that you've built it up over the years. And hopefully through some of the examples that I'll share with you, you'll be able to get a couple of takeaways. That's really my goal today, is to tell you what I've done and the lessons that I have learned. And if you are able to take some of that and apply it to your own academic careers or your budding business careers or your developing business careers, that is, I think, a job well done for the Agility program, and I'm glad to be a part of that. So the path. Dr. Brown already mentioned a few of these things. Started off in Montreal, and along the way stops in Sackville, New Brunswick, Victoria, Toronto, and now Calgary. And what's interesting is the various academic stops along the way, each played a significant part in what I've been able to get myself involved in. I view myself as a generalist, a jack of all trades and master of none. And I can tell you, in a technically intensive profession like oil and gas, that's not always an easy role to play. I'm surrounded by very specialized individuals, engineers and geologists, and I had to ask myself fairly early on, with a generalist background, where could I add value? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. I bet you that just about everyone in this room can relate to a number of these jobs that I have had over the years. Everything from being a courier to changing light bulbs, being a security guard, janitor, and then there was this sort of transition as I got into my early 20s while I was an undergrad. And I started to work in an office. And office work is not for everyone, but for me, it opened up the possibilities of using my mind rather than just my hands for the rest of my career. And I worked in the filing room of a law firm, and that also exposed me to what it might be like to be a lawyer. And I don't want to suggest that moving files around in a law firm really is like being a lawyer, but I saw lawyers in action, and I saw how they interacted with their clients, and I kind of liked that. I wasn't quite sure if that was something I wanted to get into, but nonetheless it was something that was sort of evolving for me. And then one of the more interesting jobs I had before I got full-time into law was I worked in the investment industry. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. This was in the mid-1980s, and if anyone has seen the movie Wall Street, I mean the original one with Charlie Sheen and Michael Douglas, those were heady times before the stock market crash in October of 1987. Ultimately, though, ended up, in fact, going to law school, did that for 5 years, and a door opened. And there's that risk-taking element that injected itself into my life and the life of my wife. And we decided to move out to Calgary so I could get in the oil and gas business. And that's the last little thing there. So let's just turn back the clock. I'm trying to provide as much relatability, if you would, to situations in which many of you find yourselves or found yourselves fairly recently. So I'm sitting there, it's 1980, I'm in my last year of high school. And you'll notice I've got a little red call-out box, mentor alert, mentor alert. I will be referring to those throughout my discussion this morning. So I'm sitting there as a 16-year-old, and I'm trying to figure out what am I going to do next year. And I found myself increasingly having discussions with someone, and it happened to be my high school girlfriend's father, of all people. An odd relationship, I can tell you, being the father of 2 daughters. The boys don't tend to talk to me so much. But in this case, I liked what this guy was able to do. I admired his family life. I certainly admired his daughter, but I admired his family life. I admired his educational and career trajectory. He was an RMC, Royal Military College engineering grad in the late 50s. And then he got into the budding high-tech business, worked for Terry Matthews and Michael Copeland in Ottawa for a couple of years, and then moved out to Toronto and then Montreal in a completely different business. He went into the executive search business, so the headhunting business. So he'd find senior people, presidents, VPs, etc. And I found myself increasingly talking to him, how did you get from here to there? And I would just listen, and little did I realize that that was the first instance of having a mentor. He certainly wasn't aware of it, I don't think, and I certainly wasn't aware of that active participation that we were having with each other, the interaction, but I recognized a few years later that this was a guy who I wanted to emulate, and I was putting the quiz on him all the time on how to get from where I was currently to where I might go in the future, and not exactly knowing where that might be. It was a bit amorphous, but I figured if I spoke to this guy about what he did, I might pick up a few grains of wisdom along the way. So I'm there, and I look at my science marks, and not so good, unfortunately, but I was pretty good in the rest of the stuff. And so a science undergraduate degree was not on the cards for me, so I decided to try my hand at business. So I went to Mount A, and regrettably, the first month and a half of accounting got the better of me. It was oppressive. I wasn't ready for it, didn't know how to study for it, so I transferred from business into arts, finished out the year at Mount A, and then as part of actually a master plan to get back to Montreal, I went to McGill. But in selecting my undergraduate degree at McGill in the arts faculty, I looked at something that was multidisciplinary, and I settled on industrial relations, which is shorthand for labor management relations. And what I really liked about it is it had a wonderful mix of business and liberal arts. So I got economics, I got finance, I got sociology, I got political science, I got history. And I began to see kind of the guy emerge that liked optionality, that liked versatility. I was saying to someone beforehand, you know, I view myself as a jack of all trades, but master of none. I was never expert in anything, but I was pretty good, pretty functional in a bunch of different things. And in selecting IR as my undergraduate degree, that really began my future as someone that was going to try to pull things together for a bunch of people, try to lead, try to organize, but I needed to ultimately surround myself with experts, because if you're going to be a generalist, you need to have people that are much smarter than you all around you. But that's really the first time that I started to apply actively this concept of optionality. That plus the fact that the IR degree was probably pretty marketable. Back in the day, there weren't too many jobs you could get with a BA right out of undergrad, and I certainly could get a job if I came through with my IR degree. So, I spend my time at McGill, and things are winding down. By this time it's late 84, early 85, and I've got a decision. What should I be doing? And I had not yet decided on law school, even though I had worked in a law firm in the back office, so to speak. And my marks needed some upgrading, quite frankly. I'd done pretty well, but you know, you need to get some A's in something, and I had some A's. I'm being a bit facetious, but you know what? Most people are going to try to cobble together a resume that includes some references from both people that you've had summer jobs with, part-time jobs with, and someone from school. And it's a lot easier to show up to a prof's door having done well in his or her class and ask for a reference. So off I go to Concordia, and don't you know, I went back to the accounting program and tried to slay that dragon that got the better of me 4 years earlier. And it was a much better experience, let me put it that way. Just the passage of a couple of years, and I was a better student, and I was more engaged. And so off to Concordia I go, and I take a bunch of accounting courses while I am still working. And at this point, there's another mentor alert, working in the investment industry. The next mentor in my life happened to be my stepfather, my mother's second husband. And while I was working for this investment bank, I was a young fella. I didn't know a whole lot, but like a lot of people, young or old, you walk around with a certain amount of swagger and fear of showing any kind of ignorance. And that's a bad thing, I can tell you. And you have to find some elegant way to admit that you don't know things, because knowing what you don't know is much more important than knowing what you do know. So what I would do is I would come back from work and I'd put the quiz on my stepfather. And I would say to him, can you talk to me about this concept, that concept? And that began a lifetime of mentorship between my stepfather and myself, which ultimately played into my transition from being a lawyer into the oil and gas business. That was by that time, it was a very, very, very clear relationship. I was relating to him not only as my stepfather, but clearly as someone who had a skill set, had a knowledge base that I wanted to obtain. And then I would show up at the job the next day and I would be armed to have much better discussions and be a more effective employee. So it was a very fulfilling interchange between my stepfather and I. I did a little bit of traveling along the way, not too much. And by this time we're into 1985, 1986, and I say, okay, I'm going to pull the pin and I'm going to go to law school. Now, I just mentioned a few moments ago about what that period was like, and I can tell you, there were a lot of young folks making an obscene amount of money before that stock market crash in 1987. It really was like Wall Street. And it wasn't an easy thing to decide that I was going to let that potential go to law school. So that was sort of my first. I didn't recognize it really at the time. In retrospect, I recognize it. That was a pretty risky thing to do. I could have stayed in that business, and who knows what would have happened. I know that when October '87 came, there was a bunch of 20-somethings that got completely swept out of that business because things went so far off the trolley tracks. But I decided I would go to law school. And so I applied to law school, and so I got rejected by almost every law school in Canada. And I think there's about 15, 16, 17 law schools in Canada. And I was hoping to stay fairly close to home for financial reasons and for personal reasons, but I only got accepted to law schools west of Toronto. And I had never been west of Toronto, and that was kind of freaking me out a little bit. But it was also the first time that someone had ever told me, sorry guy, you're not good enough to, get here. I had never had that happen to me before, and it's a pretty sobering experience. There's a little bit of a difference between not getting picked for the AAA hockey team and then getting a letter in black and white from McGill or Dal or U of T saying thank you for your application, but please bugger off. So so I had to decide what was I going to do, and I figured if I'm going to go west, I'm going to go west, and I ended up at UVic. And I can tell you, flying over the Rocky Mountains Labor Day weekend 1986 and landing in Victoria and stepping off the plane on the island and looking around, and I said, man, I'm going to enjoy this place for the next 3 years. And enjoy it I did. Law school for me was a culmination of my educational experience where I really refined two things. One is organization, and the other was communication. And they were things that I took with me into my professional career, my post-education career, and it really helped me to find where I could contribute. I mentioned before that as a non-technical person in an industry populated by engineers and geologists, I had to figure out how I was going to add value. And I can tell you it ended up being because I developed high organization skills, and I was able to communicate, I think, effectively. There are lots of people who we all meet, we all know, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant people. But being able to express a thought, being able to pull in financing to help bring that thought into a product or a service, and then market that and be successful, that takes organization, but it also takes effective communication. And I'll talk about two-way communication, but I think I want to expand that to three-way communication. You have to communicate up to the people that you report to, whether it's your shareholders or a boss. You got to report down. You got to communicate well down to people that work for you, and you have to be able to communicate sideways very well to service providers, co-workers, colleagues. And law school really refined those skills for me. When I got there, I had just come out of an educational experience at McGill where I'd gone down this path of optionality, jack of all trades, as I said. And some people show up to law school and say, I want to be a tax lawyer, I want to be an environmental lawyer, I want to be a marine law expert, I want to be a real estate lawyer, I want to be a litigator or a barrister, or I want to be an office kind of lawyer, a solicitor. I went in there with no preconceived agenda. I wanted to get exposed to just about everything I could, because frankly, by this point, you know what, it's about getting a job on the way out. And I viewed myself as being more marketable if I had, in my interviews, I could tell the interviewer, look, I've done all of these different types of courses. So I stuck with that concept of multidisciplinary optionality, and I took a very broad course of study at school. If you can combine, you know, the development of knowledge with effective communication, that is an exceedingly powerful combination, and what I went through at law school really helped me get to that point. So school is done, and here comes career number one. I think I heard somewhere that everyone has 3 careers, so I've had 2. I'm not quite sure what the third one is going to be, but here comes career number one. So I spend 3 years in law school. Actually, by this time, it's just the summer after second year. I met the woman that ultimately I would marry. She was a lawyer as well. And we're sitting there in Victoria deciding what we should be doing for, and by this time we know we're going to be getting married. We're engaged, so we've got a life that we have to plan together, which is a tricky thing. I'm sure a number of you here today have spouses, partners, boyfriends, girlfriends, and planning, you know, your next 3, 5, 10, 15 years on your own is tough enough. But when you combine it with 2 people, it increases the logistics. But we decided we would go to Toronto, and I ended up picking a 80-person Bay Street firm that could offer me, yet again, that kind of optionality. They were a full-service firm, so it wasn't a boutique firm specializing in one particular practice of law. And I ended up rotating through all of the departments, so litigation, tax, real estate, and corporate commercial. And everything was going along swimmingly. I was fortunate that I was asked to return as an associate, which really does 2 things. For those of you that have friends, some of you may be lawyers, I don't know, or going off to law school, but what's interesting is if you get asked back by a law firm while you're an articling student, 2 things happen. One is you've actually got the job at the end of your articles after your bar admission courses are finished, but they also pay you a salary while you are at the bar admission course, which is a great thing. So my wife and I go off, we get married, we have a honeymoon that costs some money, and then the law firm implodes. It's gone, boom. 5 lawyers packaged up, gonna go to that law firm. 15 lawyers there, 20 lawyers there. And I ask, well, what about me? And it's like, yeah, thanks, Steve, but you're kind of at the bottom of our thought process right now. So we've got to scramble. And I was fortunate, though, and there's a mentor alert coming up here at the bottom. I was fortunate. One of the lawyers that I had connected with when I was articling connected with me also. And this guy was one tough bugger. I was actually surprised when he called me up and he said, listen, Steve, I'm packaging up a few other lawyers and we're going to go off and form the bankruptcy and insolvency group at a boutique law firm. Do you want to come with us? And I said yes. And that began a 5-year relationship with this chap. And it was an incredibly fulfilling thing for me, and not dissimilar from my high school girlfriend's father or my stepfather. This guy invested so much time in me, and this was a guy that did not suffer fools gladly, but he really he was so willing to share with me his knowledge. Now, there was not necessarily an altruistic aspect to this because I was going to make this guy some money. And I realized that. And that also kind of created in me an awareness that it is always really important to make your boss look good. That's something that not enough people understand, is that, and there's one of the aspects of managing up, by the way. A lot of people manage down, but there's one of those aspects of managing up. So it really was a wonderful time. I loved being a lawyer, which you don't hear a lot of lawyers say, particularly ex-lawyers. I'm not a lawyer anymore. But I loved being a lawyer. I loved working for this guy. He was a brutally hard guy on other people, but we just hit it off. And we spoke a lot. He invested a lot of time with me. We were in an area, insolvency, where we acted for a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that owed money to banks. And I saw so many failed entrepreneurs. And one of the distinguishing characteristics that seemed to be common through that was people that really didn't have much of a plan. They were good at doing something, but again, the execution of that plan was something with which they struggled. And so the concept of having a plan, not adhering to it slavishly, so you needed to have some, ability to avoid the wall as it's coming right at you, but having a plan was very, very important. And unfortunately, my job was to get these business owners out of the financial jackpot that they had gotten themselves into. But it was, again, because insolvency, I was acting for people in the construction business, the restaurant business, financial services, real estate. It really played to my affinity for getting exposed to a bunch of different things, and it carried on with what I had established as optionality. I even got exposed to an energy file, acting for the bank when it put an oil and gas, a Calgary-based oil and gas producer, into receivership. So the lesson that I took away while being a lawyer, and I've got occasionally a lesson at the bottom left there, is versatility is a useful skill. I had lots of friends that were very highly focused, but I found that I really enjoyed the nature of a versatile practice, getting exposed to a bunch of different areas. So the seminal point in my adult life occurred in 1994. So I'd been a lawyer, I'd been in the law business for a number of years, and then a door opened. And that door was opened by my stepfather. And he had segued from the investment business into the oil and gas business, relocated to Calgary, and had just exited from an oil and gas company, and wasn't quite ready to retire yet. And so we had a discussion. It was purely coincidental. We had not sought each other out, but we engaged in a discussion, and we said, wouldn't it be interesting to work together? And I respected this guy so much. He obviously trusted me, and we decided, my wife and I, that we were going to move to Calgary so that I could get into the oil and gas business. And by this time, my wife was actually pregnant with our first child. And this was the biggie risk thing. I can tell you that two lawyers working on Bay Street with a comfortable lifestyle, living in Midtown Toronto with a kid on the way, we had to think long and hard about whether or not this was the right opportunity. But the question that we asked ourselves, and I've put this down as the lesson on the bottom left, is, are we going to regret that? If we look down the road 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, are we going to say, boy, I wish we had tried that. I wish we had tried that. The reality is, if you don't do something, you're probably not going to be wrong. The status quo is a pretty comfy place to hang out. But do you want to be saying what if down the road? For some things, absolutely. You're not going to be too fussed about it. But this was one of those things in my life where I said, you know what, I don't want to be saying what if down the road. So we decided to make the big move in 1994, and boy, that was a big jump. And there's one of those things about risk assessment. For us, we viewed the law backgrounds that we had as a pretty portable credential, pretty good background, and if it didn't work out for me, then we could go back to both being lawyers. So, get to Calgary, and here is startup number one. It started off as we thought we were going to start a little oil and gas company, but in fact we ended up starting what became an energy advisory business. So we started to deploy other people's money, OPM. And that is an extremely important aspect, and it's an evolving aspect throughout your careers. I can tell you, when you're young and you don't have a lot of money, but you got a great idea, you got to find some way to grab up some OPM. And even if you do have money, you don't want to ever be putting yourself in a position where you are risking that last $100 that you have in your bank account. So you better be pretty realistic about what your capital needs are and where you're going to go get your money, and it better not be your last dime because you do need to have some fallback. So we ended up deploying some other people's money, and we managed that. It ended up being about a 7-year, sorry, more like an 8-year mandate for us. We ultimately sold that business. But I can tell you, along the way, it was very, very rough going. You know what? I had spoken to a good friend of mine who had been an entrepreneur, and I said, listen, you know what? We've got this thing on the go. We're not making a lot of money. You know, we had one fairly small income relative to what we were both earning in Toronto. Our first child had been born. Second daughter was on the way. And I remember my friend who was an entrepreneur saying, you know what? Give yourself 30 months. Not 24, not 36, not 2 years, not 3 years. Give yourself 30 months. And ultimately, when he told me that, I was probably in like about month 24 anyway, so I was getting pretty worried. But we ultimately sold that business in 2003, and I'll tell you how we sold that business. But I had to ask myself, how do I add value? And one of the things about a startup is you don't always have to be the boss in a startup. You know, hitching your wagon to someone else, you know, that mentor sort of person is how most people start off. It's rare the person that goes, you know, from 0 to, you know, 100 kilometers an hour instantaneously. So my trajectory was, as an entrepreneur involved in startups, was aligning myself with some smart people. But where could I add value? And my value was not going to be in engineering or geology. It was going to be in corporate finance, investor relations, doing these sorts of things, talking to people, trying to get OPM into my genes. And I listened a lot. I mean, I was surrounded by people, and it was like being back in the investment business. I was surrounded by engineers and geologists, and I asked so many questions, and I listened a lot, and I didn't try to shine people on. I had to admit what I did not know, and if I had done anything other, it would have been a failure. But people respected the fact that I asked questions. So if you're ever in a meeting and someone says something and you don't get it, you know what? Put up your hand and say, sorry, can you repeat that, please? So I did that. I can't tell you how many times I did that. But I started to cobble together a base understanding of a highly technical business, but I'm building on top of that triangle, that pyramid. I had the legal and some of the business background, but I needed to add to it. Hello. I needed to add to it. So ask a lot of questions, and the lesson for this one is know what you don't know. I got to say it's one of the mantras that I have said many, many times in my career. So the next startup, so we have this advisory firm, this private advisory firm, and that's going along. And in Calgary, I can tell you that it is not uncommon for people to have 2, 3, or 4 business cards. And I had a question last night, well, how did you manage the conflict, Steve? You know, you were running little Skyridge Capital, and now you're into Millennium, and then there's going to be yet another company. Ultimately, some of these conflicts become insoluble, and you have to do something. But we were running little Skyridge, building up our portfolio of mandates under management, and we thought, you know what, we should start a public company. Now, public companies are really, really fun, and I've spent almost all of my career in oil and gas in public companies. It's got so many twists and turns. It was a really exciting thing for us to start a public company. So we did a little IPO. We had to bring in a real full-blown, you know, management team. So it's not just deploying other people's money. We're actually operating an oil and gas company. We're drilling wells. We got pump jacks going, et cetera, et cetera. I can't do that. Marty, my mentor, my business partner, is an accountant. So you got an accountant and an engineer. So you have to find some way to get that knowledge, that expertise, those people that are smarter than you into the fold. So we brought in a new team, and I'm back to, you know, where can I add value? And where I added value again was I got to find some deals. You know, networking. I mentioned that on the, I didn't mention it, but I had it on the other slide. Networking. You know, networking is more than coming to a place like this or a bar and shaking hands. Networking is reaching out to service providers, you know, reaching out to people that are in industry, and not just reaching out when you want something, by the way. It's important to reach out to people and cobble together relationships in times where there is no ask, so that when you do ask for something, there's a bit of a relationship there. That's an important thing. So I had spent a couple of years developing that, those contacts, and I began to work more on mergers and acquisitions and corporate finance. And by this time, with a public company, our investor relations needs were more substantial. So that was kind of my bailiwick. It was everything non-technical. We ultimately merged that business in 2003, but what I learned out of that was we merged it with another company, and the other management team carried on. And for me, the lesson there was you can hitch your horse to a wagon, and it may not be your own wagon, though. So that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand when you're starting something. You know what? There can be a great idea that you have developed, and if people are going to pay you to take that idea and then have you get out of the way, that is not necessarily a bad thing. So don't always view what you do as something that needs to be managed by you for all time. There's a right time to exit, and in fact, the right team to manage that opportunity may well be the other team. So we got out of the way, and I can tell you that $5 million that we got for that company, if you look what happened in the hands of the next guys and you follow the rate of return forward after that, the various iterations and what they were able to do to grow that, that probably grew to about $20 million. So a prime example of sometimes, you know what, the other folks might be better suited to manage that business. So, but that exit was 2003, started in 1996, and then another opportunity comes up in 96. So now we've got like three companies, three balls up in the air, which was complex but not unmanageable. And this was a very large undertaking for us. Back in the mid-90s, income trusts were really taking off as an investment vehicle in the public capital markets. And Marty and I brought to market what it was at the time the smallest IPO for an income trust. It was a $35 million IPO, all other people's money, all OPM. And I got to tell you, that was one of the most complicated deals I have ever worked on before or since. We had an underwriter drop out. We had to pull the IPO for about 3 months. We had to find some bridge financing. Ultimately, we did it, and we started to grow that company. We grabbed up the same management team that we had helping us with Millennium, and my angle continued to be business development and corporate finance, and so I went from the VP Business Development ultimately to Chief Operating Officer, and ultimately at the end of the 9-year stint, I was the president. And we got that thing up to a size, and we sold it for $1 billion. And sometimes it's hard for me to comprehend what we were able to do there. And along the way, we generated a 25% rate of return annually. So that worked out exceedingly well. And we decided to merge it with another one of the income trusts. Yet again, an example of, you know what, I had taken this thing, I thought, as far as I could, and it was going to be in the hands of another team that could make even more money for our shareholders. And in fact, that's what's happened. If you look again at the stock value after we sold that company, our people made even more money. And in the end, you know what? There's a Bob Dylan song, "You Gotta Serve Somebody." And even though I was the president and things were going along really well, you always have to have your eye on what is right for the people that gave you that money, the shareholders, so the OPM. You know what, you do well for the people that have given you the money, whether it's your brother, your parents, your aunt, your uncle, the bank, or that gal walking out over there. You make money for them and you will do well yourself. So here comes the next startup. 2005, we've sold APF, and I grab up the same crew of guys that I had worked with, and we start Rocky View Energy. It was another public company. This time, though, what was new for me was I actually put my own skin in the game. So think of that. By this time, I am T plus 11 years into this business. And this was the first time where I felt comfortable enough to take a risk. So remember, the first risk I took was just changing jobs, moving out with my family. That was a pretty big risk. But I had still not yet put up any of my own dough into this. So this was the first time that I had my own skin in the game. And you'll find that skin in the game when you are using OPM is a very relative term. People at a certain point will want to have, and you say, well, how much is that? What's the quantum? Well, it's something that is meaningful to you. So, you know what? If you have a net worth of $10,000, then you're going to put in, if you're asked by the people that are putting in $1 million, you know what, Steve, I want you to put some skin in the game. Well, it's got to be meaningful to that $10,000. And I can tell you that people don't want you to be ruined, OPM, they don't want you to be ruined by not doing well, but they want it to pinch a little bit if you don't do well and they don't do well. So put my own skin in the game. We got a bunch of OPM. And that was an interesting, that company was just around for 2.5 years. I had always hand-picked my board of directors, and I can tell you, for people that have taken business courses or who are in business, there's some governance issues around having a completely independent board versus someone versus a board that is close with management. But I had kind of an activist investor make his way onto my board, and that was the first time where I actually had to actively manage up running a company. It was, I'd always paid attention to the shareholders, but managing up to a board of directors was something that was new for me, and it was a challenge. We ultimately sold that company for cash in 2008, and part of the challenge around actively managing the board of directors, and it's the lesson here in the bottom left, cash is king. I had one director that wanted to merge the company for stock with another company, and I wanted to merge it for cash. And ultimately, I was right, he was wrong, because I did a little calculation about a year and a half after we did that deal, and if we had taken the paper deal, that $110 million would have been worth about $35 million. So, but having little scraps with your board is not a pleasant thing, but it's all part of managing up. After that came, and we did well, by the way, in Rocky View. We generated a very nice rate of return. My shareholders came in at almost at 10 cents, and I think we sold the company for about $3 a share. So everyone did pretty well in that. Cumberland comes up. That was the next iteration, and the lesson here, bottom left, is don't step back too early. By this time, my very supporting spouse had decided she wanted to go back to work, and this speaks a little bit about the balance between professional and personal life. My business partners from APF and Rocky View were coming along with me to Cumberland, which started as a private co, and I went on as chairman of the board. I didn't go on as CEO, so I had no day-to-day responsibilities. That was a mistake. I can tell you, I'm the sort of person that needs to be involved, and each of you, to the extent that you are looking for the right thing that grabs your imagination, that fulfills you professionally and personally, you need to understand what makes you tick. And I didn't understand, even though I had spent by this time 14 years in the business. I didn't understand that stepping back was not in the cards for me, but I did that. I stepped back. I went onto some boards, both in the oil and gas business and not-for-profit, and I let my partners run the business. But I mean, I was the chairman. I was, I was in charge at the board, and we lost money for our shareholders. We ultimately took it public, but we lost money, and that was the first time that we lost money. And managing that failure was an interesting part of my professional life. You know what? Good news travels fast and bad news travels slowly. It should be the other way around. Bad news should travel fast, and good news, you know what? People through the passage of time will be okay. But we ran into the global financial crisis in 2008. It was not a great time, and I actually had to spend a lot of my time talking to people who I had recruited into the Cumberland story, and you know, explain to them what happened and why they ended up losing money. Ultimately, we ended up merging that in a transaction with another company, and again, there was an incident of the other guys being more suited to run with that ball. So entrenchment, you know, in Calgary, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of people that refuse to get out of the way because, you know what, if I sell my company on a Friday, what am I going to do on a Monday? I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. I can tell you that it's all part of doing what's right for your shareholders. And if the other folks are better equipped to run with that ball, then you've got to get out of the way. And whether it's oil and gas or whether it's anything else, it's important to do what's right for the shareholders. So we got out of the way, the other team ran with the ball. Next came another failure, which was not pleasant. And I should tell you that Marinex Energy Trust, I named it after my wife, whose name is Marin, who did not like having her name associated with a failed $200 million IPO on the Toronto Stock Exchange. I got to tell you that. So the subsidiary lesson there, and this is all in the naming of companies. I could spend an afternoon telling you how people name their companies, but don't name a company after a family member. I can tell you that. It's not good. So we started that in April 2012, and it was a brand new management team for me. I needed to pull together, an opportunity presented itself, so a door opened, and I jumped through it, but I made the mistake of not jumping through, holding hands with some guys that I'd worked with before. So, not that they weren't good, but I'm just saying that we put together the team pretty quickly. We tried to bring that IPO to the market, and it failed. And so we had to back off that. And that was another example of managing failure. It was a very public example of managing failure. I mean, there was stuff written in the Globe and Mail and the Financial Post. So, you know what, when you try to do something and you don't do it, if you can do that anonymously, that's not too bad, but if it's there black and white, Marinex withdraws IPO amid no interest, it's not that great. You know, the lesson for me there is, and this speaks a little bit to not getting too close to that wall, is sometimes, you know what, you just can't get out of the way of a broader situation. It doesn't matter how good your individual deal is, it doesn't matter if your product is great. If it's not the right time, it's not the right time, and you can't push on a rope. I remember coming out of investment banking meetings or meetings with portfolio managers, and you know, we'd all high-five each other in the elevator, and it was you know, we did a good job, and then we'd find out afterwards, well, how come no one wanted to buy this thing? And was it Cloutier? No. Was it his team? No. Was it the assets? No. It's just not the right time. So we found out the hard way that sometimes a really good idea, and we had a really good idea, if it's not the right time, there's not much that you can do about it. The next lesson for me was, boy, don't take over the barbecue after someone else has put the steak on, because it's hard to figure out when that thing is done properly. And so I went to work for a public Australian-based company. And it was the first time that I was a hired gun. And I can tell you, I thought I would like it. I didn't like it at all. I had to deal with activist shareholders. I had to deal with a disparate collection of funky assets, oil and gas assets in Quebec. I mean, I didn't even know they had that sort of, I mean, does anyone, oil and gas in Quebec? Wow, who knew? We had some stuff in South Africa, we had some stuff in West Texas, we had some stuff just south of Estevan. It was an ADD kind of conglomeration of assets, and so I came in really to solve a problem. But along the way, I just did not enjoy it very much. I had to fire a bunch of people, and I can tell you, if you've ever in your careers have to fire someone, it is an unpleasant thing to do, and I fired just about all the staff because we were bloated. Got the assets sold off, and then in the twilight of the summer of 2014, I said to the board, I said, you know what, I've done what I can here and I'm gone. So I resigned in 2014, and as I said, the lesson for me there is, boy, you know, if you don't start something yourself, if you take over something, you never know what bony skeleton is going to come out of the closet and poke you in the eye. So I decided that I would go back to what I liked, which is, and you know, play to your strength. And I went back and I started an oil and gas company, a new oil and gas company, just a couple of months ago. It's a private company. We're trying to pull out some OPM, working with private equity both in Canada and the US. And I've pulled together a team of people that I've worked with before. And we haven't done anything yet. To use an airplane analogy, the plane is in the hangar, it's ready to roll out, but it hasn't taken off yet. And we will be putting our own skin in the game once we get this thing launched, and you know, stay tuned. So the summary, and I hope that some of these things, it wasn't meant to be sort of a dissertation on, you know, where I've been and how I got to here, as much as it was what lessons did I learn along the way. And the lessons that I've learned along the way that I've kind of reflected in bullet points is work hard. There's no substitute for working hard and acquiring knowledge. Mentorship, whether it is your academic mentor, your fitness mentor, your beer mentor, your wine mentor, your car mentor, your business mentor, it's really important to look for mentors and actively engage with them. You'd be surprised how willing people are to give of their time and help you out. Human beings are probably much more giving than we give ourselves credit for. Optionality for me has always been a linchpin of what I have been able to accomplish. I've tried to keep myself open to as many types of opportunities as possible so that I have some optionality. It's not just one thing that I'm working towards. Managing failure, boy, you have to be prepared to fail. I don't know any entrepreneurs that have not had 1, 2, 3 plus failures, and it's how you respond to that. It's trite to say, you know, it's how you manage your failures, but it really is. You know, success takes care of itself. It's like good news takes care of itself. Bad news, you have to manage that. And so managing your failures is pretty important. Communication, I can't give communication enough credit. You could have a great idea, but unless you can get it out of your mouth and explain to people and do your, I didn't mention it, but there's a slide where I talked about the elevator pitch. And that is, you've got the amount of time that it takes to go from the 10th floor to the ground floor to pitch an idea to someone. You better be able to communicate effectively, because if you're fumbling over things and you can't explain what the ask is, you're not going to get a lot of money and you're going to be faced with an undercapitalized business. And lastly, I've had this little yellow sticky up on my wall for the last 20 years. It's focus on opportunities and not obstacles. You know, some people might say, Steve, you're starting up an oil and gas company with oil at $43 a barrel and gas is like $1.85 an MCF. Like, are you crazy? No, I don't think so. I think this is the ideal time to be starting something. Not so good if you are actually already in the business, because it's difficult. But boy, if you're starting up, you know, buy low, sell high. Real estate prices, if they're depressed, isn't that a great time to be getting into it? Not once real estate has gone up. Buying high and selling higher, unfortunately, is a mantra that people feel on balance more comfortable with, but focus on the opportunities. And when I saw what was developing along with everyone else in Calgary, 12 months ago, I said, there's got to be some way that I could come out the other side of this to my advantage and make some money for myself and for some other people as well. So, well, that is it. I would be very happy to answer any questions you have, either here in front of the stage or informally afterwards. So thank you very much.